Okay, hello. Thanks so much for okay. Thanks so much for coming to our online session about community accountability for racial justice. I hope those of you who've arrived here will have seen some of the documentation. It's a piece of work that the Black Member Standing Committee of UCU have been working on, partly in response to events around state violence and policing, partly as an outcome of our far too long history of trying to engage really quite resistant employers on matters of race equality. So much polite committee sitting, so many attempts to work in partnership with employers who are so exceptionally rude and sometimes quite overtly racist in all of their actions. That felt like that was not the flavor of the last few years in terms of anti-racist politics. So we've written this document that we hope will really represent a step change in how we think about what an anti-racist politics in our trade union and our sector is. And it starts by saying no employing organization, most of all those steeped in elitism as tertiary education tends to be. I know not so much as universities, but certainly universities and even colleges kind of feel themselves to be very powerful in their neighborhoods, like they're the kingpins, everyone else is the client. That those kinds of organizations cannot measure their own progress towards racial justice. If we don't trust the police to police themselves, we should not trust employers to police themselves. And all of our experience as trade unionists and as community members and as anti-racists shows us that, that you can't say to people who are doing the harm, can you go away and try better than tell us how well you're doing? So this whole program is a way of bringing a kind of abolitionist lesson to trade union organizing, to say that we need to organize not only within the workplace, but beyond and across the workplace into the community. We need to bring our communities back into the workplace to throw a scrutinizing light on our very, very backward employers who need some help. It's a way of helping them become a better version of themselves. And that through doing that, that's the only way that a really liberatory, just education that belongs to us all even gets to be on the table. That we need to start from that, from saying, your boss's table, that's not enough. It's not even the real table. We're going to bring more people to come and look at you, and then let's see the conversation we have. Now, I hope that makes sense and even sounds exciting to people. It isn't how we've always, as trade unionists, organized, but it is in the history of trade union organizing to be with our communities, to organize side by side, to say that our institutions belong to the community. And I hope today we'll talk about some ways that we could think about taking this forward and really feel like we reclaimed educational spaces as a community resource, as something that belongs to us, not something that occupies us or lives alongside us or colonizes our local neighborhoods, but feels like they have no responsibility. And I hope that you'll all join us in that conversation, and more than the conversation, the journey to come in how we make it true.
Hello.
Hi. It's mine that's slow, I know, sorry. So I was just hoping that Dahlia might first say something about her thoughts around some of these ideas about the boundaries of the organisation of the institution.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gargi, and thank you so much for this event. I had a look through the materials and I was just like, oh, this is so perfect for the moment that we're in right now, because for a lot of us, anti-racism organizing in the university, and I say this as a baby, so maybe not for all of us, it's been a long thing, and it's been something that has involved a lot of shut doors and a lot of we're not interested. And now that we are in this kind of moment where everyone's sort of scrambling to get a kind of part of that anti-racist cachet, I think it's really important now to regroup and set out what the boundaries and what the kind of principles are in that new moment. So how long do you want me to speak for, Gargi, or do you want me to just like say a couple of things and then have it more conversational?
Why don't you speak for like a few minutes, like 5 minutes or so?
Okay, yeah. So I think when we're thinking about anti-racism in the university, I always think it's a really, like, we often talk about like what does the anti-racism part of that mean, and that's important, obviously. But I also sometimes find it useful to think about what a university is as like an interesting starting point. I think that thinking that helps to focus our thoughts, it helps to focus our strategy, it can help us to understand and clarify what's worth fighting for in the institution, and also what's actually not fought for in the university, or what the role of the university is then in other struggles. And keeping that clarity and focus is really important when, like I said, universities are clamoring to get an anti-racist reputation at the moment, and so a lot of shit is getting thrown at us, and it can help us clarify like what alliances we want to make, and think about, you know, those non-reformist reforms versus reactionary reforms, to borrow a really useful framework from the abolitionist movement. So, you know, universities are one of the few spaces that exist in our society at the moment, and that's deliberate, to subsidize and create space for intellectual work, paid intellectual work. That intellectual work is important for our movements. It doesn't have to happen in the university, and perhaps there's hopefully one day a world in which kind of the university form feels very like in a really odd and anachronistic way to do that. But it's a space that we have now, and the fact that it is one of those only spaces where that kind of work is subsidized and made space for means it is an important one. And what's allowed to happen there, what happens there, what is punished, who is punished, in what ways, what is encouraged, who's allowed in, who's allowed out, is all important to consider. It's also an employer, it's a boss. It's a massive institution that is reproduced by so many different kinds of work, from research to cleaning to administration to teaching. And all of these kinds of work go into subsidizing and making space for that intellectual work. And that's really important, because I think a lot of that labor of reproducing universities relies on unpaid work, because it's allowed to go unpaid and unrecognized because it's framed as like a passion. And having a really sober understanding of that employment relationship, although this gets really fuzzy when you look at different kinds of employment, from full-time, precarious, contracted work, is important, because labor is such a key way that, you know, race and racism are made. So who does what work and how that work is valued is really important here. It's also a place that confers power. It, you know, in the eyes of society, it consecrates what knowledge is. It decides what should be given resources to know about, what things we should know about, who should do that thinking and finding out about those things. And that knowledge isn't just constrained to the institution, it goes out into the world and it makes different things possible. But it's also, I think, important to look at not just how the university exists in the world through knowledge, but also how it exists in collaboration with other institutions that confer racialized violence and dispossession, like the military and the defense industry, the fossil fuel industry, other commodities, the institution of finance capital. And I think one of the ways, you know, we talk a lot about co-option, and, you know, co-option is kind of always going to be one of the primary techniques that are used to defang our movements. I think that we shouldn't respond to co-option with surrender. We should respond to co-option with an understanding that that is one of the key techniques of, you know, splintering and confusing and kind of kicking up dust into our eyes. And one of the ways that I think we can respond to that is by really connecting those, the frameworks that we use, whether it's anti-racism or decolonizing or Black Lives Matter, to material ideas that cannot be co-opted. And so one of that can be thinking about how we break the material reliance of higher education in these kinds of institutions that I mentioned before, like the military and the defense industry, fossil fuel industry, etc., which is accelerating as public funding of universities decreases. How do we, and that also comes through in our material demands for conditions of work for all of the people and all of the workers and all the kinds of work that go into sustaining our university. And, you know, in the context of higher education, I think there are many avenues for accountability. I think the first and most obvious way is the myriad of ways, like I said, that our institutions collaborate with and facilitate racialized violence, both inside the university and outside. So using police to address, you know, social sort of things, calling police on student activists, reliance on punitive assessment methods, collaborating with harmful racially profiling programs like Prevent and the hostile environment, the various practices that leave workers precarious, which we know obviously disproportionately affect workers of color. And I think we also, as Gargi kind of mentioned, really need to think about how universities interact with their local communities. Do they impose themselves, suck up resources of and from local residents, and make the area generally less hospitable? Or is the local community integrated into the learning and educational resources that are currently being gatekept by universities? How can we really chip away at that border between the inside and the outside of the university and make that boundary so porous that it doesn't really exist anymore? So I think that those are kind of my ways of thinking, my avenues for how we reckon with that co-option threat in this moment, and how we can try and clarify our thinking so that we make sure that we fight for those non-reformist reforms and also are really discerning in the alliances and the things that we accept and how we use them within a broader struggle.
No, that's great, Dalia. Thank you. You covered all of the things I hoped you would, and kind of built that link across many other trade union aspirations beyond a kind of narrow view of anti-racism, much more to how we think about making our workplaces beacons of justice, not another institution of violence, really. Umit, I wonder if you wanted to add to that and bring in some other views.
I think, Dalia, and you just explained really well about the positions of universities. But I think our program clearly tells us that our program is not just for training program, it is an organizing tool. It is not another way of getting the committees and talking to people, this is what's going to happen, this is not going to happen. What we want is organizing from grassroots and change the structure. That is, I think, this program needs to be used. And also the question is, what kind of university we want? I think Dalia and you touched upon what universities are doing, what kind of university we want. This is I think our program opposed to neoliberal university. Our program opposed to profit-making university. Our program demands a community involvement. Our program demands universities reflect where the communities they serve. I think, but in order to achieve anti-racist university, I think universities has to be changed, and we need to challenge those structures like Dalia mentioned about Prevent. And Prevent is a law. Sometimes in order to challenge structures, we need to break the structures. We need to be challenging the state. We need to be challenging the laws. We need to break the laws in order to gain some advancement. And also, our universities, I am new to actually higher education. I come from further education background. I taught 15 years in the further education, last 5-6 years in the higher education. And I saw how things changed since 9/11, because my first day of teaching was 9/11, 2001. Imagine I was going to Bradford College, and my first day of teaching an A-level politics class, and 9/11 happened. Since then, as an immigrant and a person coming from an undesirable part of the world, let's say Middle East, and I have seen it how our lives has changed over the years in one day, and our union, how we have reacted to these changes has been very slow. We need to be more, I think, faster. And I think our community accountability for racial justice program will give us some momentum. And we will be able to organize in our workplaces, not just ourselves, but with other trade unions. I think that is really important, because we cannot achieve what we want to achieve, anti-racist education and anti-racist community, on our own. We need to be creating alliances. We need to be working with other groups, and most importantly, other oppressed groups, because this is about oppression. And if we don't create link with the other oppressed group, whether however people define themselves, the sex, race, gender, class base, we need to be working together. And that is not just for creating a new university, but creating for new society. I think that should be our aim. We should be thinking bigger than our education, but we should be thinking changing our whole society. And I was also thinking when Dalia started talking about hostile environment. Our universities are, and our further education, and even primary schools, secondary schools are really being affected by hostile environment. Lecturers are basically another tool of state mechanism in order to, we are checking our international students. We are checking our international students whether they are attending or not, and there's a reporting mechanism. There's not enough reporting mechanism for racism or discrimination, but there's a brilliant reporting mechanism of talking about students' attendance. I think they are the things we want to really change, and we need to be mobilizing, I think, outwards rather than inwards. That is what our community accountability, racial justice for racial justice is there for. Outward, work with the people outside, anti-racist organization, community group, religious groups, anyone who's against racism, anyone who's against oppression. I think that will be a starting point for us.
No, absolutely. I think you've summed it up very well, and that it's clearly been a lesson of anti-racist and everyone fighting for justice across organizations for some time, that you need to spread your focus of where your allies are, not narrow it. I think, though, in the committee, though, we've been, the Black Member Standing Committee, we have had some, not concerns, but I think one of the things we might want to think as a union is how do we build that capacity amongst our members and activists? Because trade unions, if they ever have had it, have lost a lot of that skill base of how you build a broader alliance, how you speak to people not like yourself, how you even, it's all very well to say community organisation. People haven't done a lot of that as workplace reps for some time. And I think part of what we thought we might talk about is a bit like, how do we begin in a way that people feel empowered, not like, oh, I did that in a rubbish way, I'm never going to do it again. Like if you send people off down the, when I was young, you go off down the road and you get sent off in the road with some leaflets. These are the people we're trying to get, go in this building, go in this shop, people are praying here, stand there and try and make people talk to you. And if it goes badly, you think, oh, I'm never going to do that again. I think we're almost starting afresh with a whole generation of trade unionists about what does it mean to mobilize with the community? How do we start to build that? And I wondered if anyone had some ideas about how we might begin to help people do that kind of work again.
I mean, I think that this is a really, really important question. I think oftentimes in my own experience, I found that one of the best ways to do it is like, obviously there is the kind of, you go and you try and create things, but there's also and especially when I'm thinking about the university that as existing within a kind of broader neighborhood and a broader community and a broader kind of like in a town or a city, and really being cognizant and aware of what is already being done and thinking about how, and I was speaking to, I was on something else and Lala Khalili brought up this thing where she said, I think she was quoting someone else about organizing with and within the university, which is like using the resources of the university to build, to like help support and also engage and offer resources, whether it's rooms or photocopying or whatever, for like organizing structures and things that already exist in whatever their forms. And that builds that kind of trust, and it builds that kind of like sense of attachment and sense of mutuality that I think no amount of like speaking at someone can really do, you know?
And I think that, and of course, that's a big lesson of community organising, that if you're in, and it doesn't feel like universities are more resource, but they're frankly still more resource than most communities, and they have buildings. But now that we are not physically with each other, that how we replicate that for a while and serve as really a hub, that a lot of progressive education has been about how do you open the doors of educational organisations so that our resources can be used more openly. I think we need to revisit all of that, especially maybe as things change through the year and people need so desperately to have some spaces of community gathering and togetherness. Did you want to say something, Amit?
Yes, I thought during this COVID pandemic period, I found meeting with people much easier than what we used to work in the buildings, because like what we can do here is sometimes you can meet with people with other side of the world, come here and we can start and talking about issues. But what I am hoping to do with our material and my workplace in Manchester University, start from our own union members first, get our union members on board, Black, brown, all of them, not just our Black members, get them on board, then work with the campus unions. We've got Unison, we've got Unite, we've got other unions. We need to be working with them. And people who are on union and not in union, unionized and non-unionized people, because we want to get people to join the unions. Actually, what I believe is the unions has power, and as a class, as working class, we have power and we can change things. If we organize together, we will be able to do this in our workplaces. I think that community accountability program, our handbook, let's say, would allow other sisters unions to join with us and take it on board, and we can all together approach the management. And we don't want this to be another management tool to create a kind of statistic. We don't want to reduce our tools to be reduced to statistic. And we want this to be a working and organizing tool to change the current established practices. I think we should be able to do this. Then we can move out university and work with the other groups, anti-racist groups, local community groups, then create a little bit more communities of resistance, what Sivanandan said, is that we can create their community.
And I also think that actually, like, in terms of that, like, building union power and stuff, I think the one thing that actually has been really interesting in the pandemic is that, in a context where people are suddenly realizing a lot of hard truths about work and about their bosses and about what, they are as a worker, and, the state and bosses are kind of together, like, trying to figure out what number of deaths they can get away with to get, they keep testing it, how many deaths can we get away with? How many cases can we get away with before there's backlash, and kind of negotiating that. And the infrastructures that have stood up and won are the unions. I think that, like, unions don't do enough to, like, toot their own horn, as it were. Like, the NEU as, like, the institution that was able to step in that context and be the collective voice. I think there's an opportunity there for, like, after years and years and years of, like, propaganda against unions and, all of that, I think there's something there to be said that, like, when there was no one to fight for the workers and to fight for you to be safe in your workplace, like, collective union power did it. And that's something that I think has been really important in the pandemic as well. And is something that, hopefully we can use to drive up, and understand and, like, really expand our understanding of how the union operates as an institution.
No, I really agree, Dalia. And I think also it's already in what you've said that partly what's happened is that not only that trade unions have been shown to be the only people who fight for you in your workplace, trade unions have been the only voice speaking for the broader population's right to live and not be unwell and to be safe. You know, no other voice in British political life now. And I think that does change the framework we're operating in, because people have suddenly clocked that when people are talking about their workplaces, if they work in schools, or maybe if they work in colleges and universities, or if they work in hospitals, they're not just talking about their staff handbook, their narrow conversation with their employer. They're talking about me and my family and our ability to stay alive and eat and be safe in the world. And I think that's also part of the shift we're living through. So it's like how we capture that so that we are speaking for each other and not split apart. I mean, I guess I think that's a real possibility. But I still think there's a bit more work to be done about how we persuade people that colleges and universities are that thing. You know, schools are that thing because anyone who's ever had a child or been near a child has had a contact with a school, and schools have been a major route of transmission in this country. I think actually because many, many more people are going to university and college, especially in Black and brown communities, that people feel that these places should be ours, but they're not yet. But that's just my hunch. And I wondered if either of you thought, are there ways that we can persuade more people that they should care what's happening in universities, that it's not solidarity with someone different, but it's me. You know, what happens in universities, that matters to me. It matters to my kid. It matters to my cousin. This is my thing you're spoiling. Because I think that's part of what community mobilizing must be, that people do it not as a favor to you, but they feel that they do it because it's for them, absolutely for them as well. Hope that makes sense.
No, I think you're right, Gargi. And Dalia mentioned about NEU's action, how NEU just showed up as a vanguard of working class. It showed everybody we can change government's opinion. That is really twice this conservative government, this I will often say the racist government, it changed their view on schools returning time. So that is really important, and the unions can do this. And about communities feeling the university is my place, it comes to, I think, the elite universities do really working class Black and brown communities. They do things that elite universities their place. That is the question I think we need to ask ourselves. Like, what is the university for? What do they do for me? And the academics, do they produce things for the community? They are the questions I think we need to ask again and demand a new university. And as you said, we've got lots of work to do. But I think we need to have hope over there. And this is why we are in here, sitting in a Wednesday afternoon, evening, before our meal, just discussing and trying to organize our members and wider community.
I wondered if you had any thoughts on that, Dalia, about making the university feel like it's a public asset.
Yeah, I think that is something that it's something that I keep coming back to. And I think on the one hand, there's this idea that, you know, I think for a lot of people, I think there's been a conscious move to make university a very transient space. So it's something that people kind of like pass through very quickly. But also that its function is, you know, that it is kind of like an employment. It's all oriented towards employment, right? And it's all oriented towards, okay, how can we make and this is where kind of like the attack on like the arts, the attack on the social sciences as something that is not employable kind of comes from. And I think that there's a really tricky thing there where we have to be able to kind of demonstrate why, first of all, that having a public university is possible, and having a public university will, you know, is important and will create so many and will help it will help in the fight for other public goods. But also, I think there's a way we need to think about the way that is done in a context where academics are, where, you know, impact is being used as a club to beat researchers with and a club to be academics with. And this idea of like what impact is like engineered through like, it's like, oh, if you've done like a policy paper with like a recognized institution, then that's impact. But if you've, you know, if your work and your research has been like really has been used by anti-gentrification protesters in their kind of like, you know, your data has been used in their campaign, that's not considered like impact. So I think that, you know, something about turning that language on its head, making it not this punitive, scary thing that you have to tick in order to keep your job, but actually something that is part of our, you know, understanding of what it means to be in community with each other and, you know, with people who are in the university and people who are outside of the university as well. And I think that idea of university doesn't have to just be part of like the employment matrix. It can be a public good, and it can help in the struggle for other public goods, and for, you know, and that is actually really, really integral, and it helps to break that idea that it's just this transient functional thing that you go through in order to get a job at the end of it. And part of that can be looking towards like the history that, you know, students and campuses and universities have always played in like really key moments of struggle. What is it about this space and this institution that makes it firstly the target of, you know, reactionaries all the time? It's like a classic thing of like, you know, moral panics around what's happening in our universities, but also why it's always been this like really like this space that has done this kind of thing. And, you know, creating an attachment to that history, I think, can be really useful. I certainly find it like inspiring and helpful. Yeah.
And also, I mean, we're all circling around this, of course. We're living in a time where there's been such a privatization of public space that the university in particular, perhaps alongside religious organizations, is one of the few spaces that could be used as kind of open community space for a whole range of ways of being with each other. And I think that has to be our future, quite apart from our anti-racism, you know, that these resources, there are resources in a time when there's a real absence of spatial resources. Dom from the West Midlands, I now know, has asked whether there are case studies, and there's been a response. Just for if there are UCU branches out there, even if it's not UCU branches, that this work, we're just beginning, and we've got a few branches who want to work with the Black Members Standing Committee to just trial the programme in the way that Umut is saying, as an organising programme, not that you first go to your employer, although you might go to your employer as well, but it's like a roadmap of how to build some alliances, bring some different people in the room, start to grow that element of your union branch. And if you're in a branch that might like to do that, please do contact us. I think Chris Nicholas's email is in the chat. Chris Nicholas is the official who works with the Black Members Standing Committee, and Chris can put you in touch with the committee, and we're trying to find ways of helping launch events or have that conversation with branches who'd like to do it.
I think that would be really good, just to Black members, standing committee members, to go to branches and launching this program. That will be really useful. And also, we need to think about, we can directly, union reps can use it in their branch executive. They can discuss it, and they can take it further and communicate with their members and use it as an organizing tool from the beginning. Is it not just for the anti-racist tool, but anti-oppression tool? We need to get the groups from women group, LGBT groups, immigrant groups, and other groups to join together so we can campaign under one banner, but with different aims. And that is possible.
Yeah. And as Dali's already said, that universities, in particular, universities and colleges, actually colleges I think have been more corporatized a little bit earlier than universities. So we've forgotten in our folk memory. But because colleges are often, their building spaces are much more embedded in local communities, FE has been extremely important in terms of community organising across progressive issues in this country, because that's often where you can get a room. Often the buildings are kind of near the high street, near where people live, but equally university campuses have been. my sense is that some of that activity has fallen away, and that part of this might be a way of rebuilding that. That you want people to think, when I move to a town, it matters to me if there's a college or a university, because that means I know there's a certain network of people and resources and activity that I can tap into, whether or not I'm studying at that organisation, because that's part of the kind of the fabric of justice work in that place. And it's a kind of slightly receding history, but it's kind of in people's memories. So maybe that's something that will also bring community members on, because there'll be people in the community who can remember that. I've certainly less in London, but when I lived in Birmingham, at every Birmingham university I worked at, there'd always be people who'd never been to university who'd say, you work there, I used to go to these meetings or this thing there, because that was embedded in their lives.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting when we talk about like anti-racist organizing as something that is important to our understanding of what the university is, because if we think about the ways in which the university has retreated as a space that like you can't get a room as easily, and you can't and you have to go through all of these you can't even get into the buildings without cards and all of that. So much of that has happened through the lens of Prevent, because obviously like a really racialized thing, and how like counter-terror and racialized like boundary making is what has made the university inaccessible for everyone, and how kind of like that's why anti-racist organizing is so integral, whether or not you consider yourself as someone who is racialized or you're someone who does your work on race. And I think that's kind of really, that's just like what I was thinking about, of like, why has it become so difficult to like have open meetings in these institutions anymore? And it's through security and like racist discourses and stuff, right?
I think Gagi mentioned earlier is about the further education colleges, how they have been under attack before universities. And there's an ideological attack on further education colleges, because not many rich kids goes to further education colleges. The colleges are there for the working class communities from all backgrounds. Where I work at Bradford College for 15 years, and 70% of my students, they were all from different backgrounds. In one class, we had 13 different languages spoken. And that is the richness of further education colleges. That is the richness of community. But current and the governments have been attacking on working class education and further education and job loss and courses being closed. It's the same thing happened. This happened in the first further education colleges, then moved on to higher education institutions. Now, as Dalia mentioned, arts and languages or social science has been under attack because they are not making money. And I think our program is one way of challenging the neoliberal ways of running our universities and undemocratic running of our universities, because we want a democratic universities. We want universities run by staff and students. Let's not forget the students here, because they are crucial. When we are on strike, students are always with us. And as Dalia mentioned earlier, students are the radical aspects of our universities. And some students occupied buildings at Manchester University against rents, and they went on rent strike, and they want 30% rent reduction from university. I think that is really important. They campaign against racial profiling of students at campuses, and they are winning. And we need to be part of that winning groups, and they need to be part of our unions. We need to be working together in order to achieve what we want to achieve.
Thanks so much, Umit. That's really helpful to say that. There's been a question from Rachel in the chat saying that I'm in Norwich, which is a city of sanctuary. How do you think this would intersect with the organising agenda? And we've tried to be very explicit that that we consider the hostile environment to be part of the set of techniques of violent state racism, and that it's partly the hostile environment against all migrants and people thought of as migrants that creates this culture of violence in the organization, but also brings that responsibility to us to challenge it. But I certainly think those cities of sanctuary processes, because often our employers, even if they've not thought of any other things, they want to be part of that kind of process. So it's a kind of lever to get things in. But I don't know if either Dalia or Umut have got any further thoughts about how we might use alliances like City of Sanctuary to help lever in a slightly more, perhaps not aggressive, but slightly more extensive anti-racism, perhaps.
Yeah, this reminds me of when I was in like 2015, when we were working on this campaign that was that we wanted to roll out in lots of different universities, and it's like it's moved along. It's someone else, like other people are working on it now, but the kind of original idea with it, and this idea of cities of sanctuary, was also like this idea of like taking it, being like, yes, this is a good like intention and a good initiative, but highlighting the places where it's a contradiction, right? So it's like, okay, there's this city of sanctuary idea, or this like idea of a sanctuary, but how can it be a sanctuary when, and the aim of this campaign was about divesting from the border industry. So we wanted to take the framework of divesting from the fossil fuel industry, which had been quite successful in universities, and say, okay, how can we think about this in terms of companies and research initiatives that are geared towards, like all of the different industries and like technologies and things that make a border possible in different ways. And there was a thing of like kind of saying, okay, well, there's this acknowledgement that, we have a duty of care and we have a responsibility and a political duty towards people who are, who are excluded from that idea of the public in public university through migration and things like that. Well, there's a contradiction there if we still continue to, outside of the university and external to it, contribute to those infrastructures. So I think something about like, I mean, we did it on like a shoestring resources. So something about like actually putting in the work of researching and making visible those connections between the so-called sanctuary campus, that is kind of very fluffy and very not fluffy, but like very kind of like, oh, this is like quite nice. And actually saying, but you're implicated in these ways and all of these really violent things that are spatially probably very far away from university, but ideologically and technologically very close.
Thanks so much. I mean, we've had another question. So Umut, I'm going to ask you the question, and if you want to talk on the previous one, maybe bring it together. That Tracy has written this quite scary, people who work in the sector will know that this is scary stuff. The appointment of free speech champions in universities, what impact that going to have, I'd say, on our work, but also on how we're going to think about this program for racial justice in this kind of climate. And I know both of you have got things to think about this, but maybe let's take Umut first.
I think the free speech champion is completely opposite what they are talking about. This is what it's all about stopping dissent, I think, free speech champions. And we are going to be, earlier we talked about how prevent create the impact on us. And also another important issue I think we need to be talking here, part of our racial justice campaign, is IHRI definition of anti-Semitism. How criticizing state of Israel becomes identified as anti-Semitism. This will create problem for many of us who has been campaigning for the Palestinians' human rights, Palestinians' rights, and also campaigning against racism. So there will be a problem. I think we need to be opposing free speech campaigns, and we need to be opposing these kind of policies government is imposing us in order to stop dissent, in order to stop criticism of racist and criticism of oppressive regimes. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think it's about stopping certain speech, because in different and stopping things like certain activities. It's also about facilitating and creating the pathway for other things. It's also about, like, before we were really good at kind of saying what the ground rules are and what the kind of like what we won't allow and stuff, and having kind of like that more and having that kind of collective understanding of what we want this university to be for. And then the free speech pathway is basically a way to bulldoze through that and create a pathway through which really oppressive and damaging things can take place. Because if you look at the actual like framework, the whole idea is that if you are denied a platform, you can sue a university for compensation. Now, obviously, that makes absolutely no sense, because that means that any point at which I'm not given a platform at a university, I can sue that university. So I could be suing a university right now because they're not platforming me. This obviously like makes no sense. But what it does is it creates this, like, because there's no actual collective demand to hear racist, fascist speak, stuff on a campus, it's a way to basically force universities to have to allow that and have to have that represented consistently. And it's an attack on anti-fascist organizing, right? It's really, really, worrying how effective this kind of framing has been, when we know that it's nothing to do with free speech, because at the exact same time, people are being criminalized and people are being losing their jobs, losing their livelihood for expressing and, organizing and having all of these things that are supposed to be these rights, like free speech and freedom to associate. So it is kind of like very clear and transparent to us what's happening. The question is, how do we cut through it and make it clear to everyone else that that's what's happening? Because it's clearly a framework that is convincing to a lot of people, unfortunately.
And I think that's a really interesting idea about how we might bring together the community accountability program and that kind of strange threat, and whether we might think of part of our community building is to have public events about the threat of fascism and anti-fascist organising within and outside the organisation, and what would it be to make the university a safe place for all communities. Because clearly they also think that once they get any few campuses to have some horrible far-right speaker, and there'll be 2 or 3, then that lets everyone else in the community know that place is not for you. That's the fascist hosting place, because that again happened in the late 70s and early 80s. They don't need a mass, that they then it gets branded as that. Now I hope that Larissa Kennedy, the NUS president, is here. And perhaps
yes, so sorry that I'm only able to join for a portion of the call, but thank you so much for having me, and I'm really, really excited about this community accountability program. It sounds really, really cool.
That sounds excellent. I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit, Larissa, about particularly your views and how it might link with work NUS is doing, or how we might collaborate around this kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just, first of all, was really, really excited when I saw the documents that folks sent over on this program, particularly when I saw the heading around an anti-racism for abolitionist times. And I think I was really excited because I think in this moment with the pandemic and everything, I've spoken a lot about Arundhati Roy's point about the pandemic being a portal, and I've, in relation to anti-racism, been talking a lot about that portal, at least I think, leading to the abolition of the university as we know it. And I think within that, we see a lot of these claims that community is, and the erosion of community within the university, right? And the assumption that the student community is separate from the staff community. And of course, we know that's absolute nonsense. And to see something that seeks to build solidarity between students and staff, that seeks to build community accountability, that seeks to kind of uproot the ways that the marketized university has evaded accountability as well for racism being an embedded part of the lived reality of the institution. Like, it's really, really exciting to me, and it's so there's so much synergy with the work going on within the NUS Decolonize Education campaign, which is both seeking to decolonize education but also looking inward. And I'm really excited. I hope that wasn't too rambly, and I'm sorry, as I'm jumping in so late in the game, don't know kind of what the format is, so please let me know if I'm doing too much. But yeah, thanks for having me.
No, that's excellent. Thanks so much. I wonder if Dalia and Umut might want to ask Larissa anything or extend Larissa's point. So we did hope it'd be more conversational between you. But
I was going to ask how UCU and NUS can work together at universities and colleges to take our program further up, and can NUS branches use our tool to work with us so we can challenge university management about racism, especially structural racism, and how we can involve outside community together. I don't know what kind of things we can do together. That is what I was going to ask.
Yeah, I think there's a particularly powerful opportunity to work together locally. Like, that's what it is at the crux of it. Like, right, it's so important that when students feel like, okay, I wanna do anti-racist work, like they know automatically that there is solidarity to build there. And so I think there's a role for us in, like, there's a lot of student communities who are coming into this organizing fresh, and like, how can we consistently be reminding people that space is there and that this tool is there. And definitely, like, I think as a local organizer prior to being in this role, like, one of the best things was just having staff and union organizers just reach out to me and just be like, oh, we've seen the work going on, like, how can we support, and vice versa. And I think it is as simple as that. Like, absolutely, institutionally, we can link up. But at the end of the day, it's about building those connections locally that make all the difference, I think. But yeah, I don't know what your experience has been of that. And yeah, it'd be great to hear more about kind of whether that you've seen the routes to building that local student staff solidarity in anti-racist work and so on.
Dalia, I wondered if you had any further thoughts on that kind of alliance building.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I think the program, then the toolkit, could be really useful for is, I think, you know, a lot of students probably feel like super energized by the fact that, again, it's become, you know, thanks to the campaigning and the movements and the protests that we saw over the summer, it's becoming something that universities are increasingly, you know, trying to scramble to, like, get a piece of. And I guess, like, a lot of students sense that, you know, okay, this kind of feels like a bit like, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't know how I feel about the way the university is, like, putting out a statement and, like, doing all of this. And I think what this is really useful for, is about basically, and I described it earlier as, like, these institutions are kind of trying to kick dust into our eyes so that we can't really see what it is that we were originally fighting for, and giving us lots of different things instead of that. And I think this toolkit can be really useful to help students kind of refocus and reorient and think, okay, we're getting a lot of people asking for our time and asking to do all these different things, but what are the actual things that we want to get out of this moment? And I also think, like, and it's something that connects the point that you made, Larissa, on this idea of abolition, and also the other things that we've sort of been saying about how the university is a public good. And I wonder to what extent part of our struggles in the university and part of what we're fighting for is that the university is no longer the only space where you can get a room, or the only space where you can have these resources, and the only space where, like, we think of learning and education as happening. And, you know, how can we kind of, like, broaden our struggles to think about it in that way. I guess that is more of a kind of abolitionist sort of approach that I thought it was really interesting that you kind of raised when you chat.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that. And sorry, my eyes are really watering, so it must be the dust you mentioned. It must be getting in my eyes right now. But yeah, just picking up on that point about kind of spaces beyond the academy and beyond the institution. Like I feel very lucky to be a small part of the team at the Free Black University, and I almost see that space as really doing that work for Black folks specifically. And what does it mean to have you know, a space for education that is inherently anti-racist, that is centered on the access to knowledge and centered on the healing of Black people, centered on care for Black people. And honestly, it's amazing space to be part of, because it almost, I didn't even realize it, but just by being in that space, we were approaching education in a completely different way. We were approaching knowledge in a completely different way. And there's so much power in that. And so I think the conversations around decolonization and democratization and demarketization are, you know, they're so indivisible. But there's also like, how do we extend that to like, actually, can the institution provide what we're seeking? And I think the Free Black University came from a space of feeling that, you know, in this moment and you know, in the near future, we don't see that happening because of how horrendously racist these institutions are, because of the fact that, you know, for so many Black students and students of color, they reproduce the trauma and the all of the issues that we face outside of the academy are reproduced within it. And yeah, so I think there's so much power in kind of extracting the resources of the institution to look towards community education, and again, that's something I think there's massive of scope for student staff solidarity on, and I know something that we had the joy and privilege of doing locally when I was organising back at Warwick, in collaboration with the Black Conscious Coventry, which was a local organisation we worked with there, and yeah, I would just like, I think that kind of model of students and staff working together to extract from the institution and build those spaces in the community are really, really powerful. So I really love that point, and just thank you so much for raising it.
Thanks so much for that. People can probably see that our hour is nearly up. So I just want to let people know that, well, we've already said that if there are branches that would like to work on this programme, please do contact us, because we're trying to find spaces to just begin the work. And it's not a programmatic programme. There are different ways of doing it. No community organising programme says you have to take these steps. It's saying, here's a menu of things you might do, but this is the prize that we're all trying to keep our eyes on. We're also going to be holding, I think probably now, not until April, some CPD seminars about using this programme within your branches or across organisations. I hope that people will consider attending them, and perhaps consider attending them with some branch comrades, because the first part of organising, as different people in the room have said, is get your little team together. Oh, excellent. We already have the dates here, so they're up on the screen. So please do note down Rob Hancock and Chris Nicholas's emails, and they're the people that you need to get in touch with to be at that programme. And I think that's it for today, because my computer says 6 o'clock. I'd like to thank again everyone who came to speak and everyone who came to listen. We're really excited about this piece of work, and we hope once we're allowed to go out the house again, we'll be seeing each other in the streets and make the university something different. Thanks for your time. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for coming.